Hello, everyone. My name is Hamid Mamdouh. I am a member of the Friends of Multilateralism, the FMG. I am a former director of services and investment at the WTO, and currently I'm senior counsel with the law firm King & Spalding. I am addressing you today with a guest who is known to everyone, doesn't need any introduction. Jonathan Freed is not just an old friend, but also he is a former Canadian ambassador to the WTO. And during his time at Geneva, he chaired the dispute settlement body and the general council, which are the highest governing bodies of the organization. He was also a chief negotiator for Canada during the China accession negotiations. Jonathan has an exceptionally extensive experience in the area of trade policy, finance policy, as well as trade diplomacy. He's currently active with Albright, Stonebridge, as well as the CSIS, which is Center for Strategic and International Studies, as well as with other forums. So it really is a great opportunity to have Jonathan with us today to talk about what? Talk about e-commerce. E-commerce is one of the long-standing priorities in international trade. It's been with us for a while, but it keeps evolving and shifting from one form to the other, raising new issues. It is increasingly important now than when we started with it in the 90s because of the technology-driven process of digitalization, which expands opportunities, but also expands challenges and raises issues for regulators that require appropriate responses. Now, all that actually got turbocharged by COVID, as we know, which actually accelerated the process of digitalization beyond what was expected at any point in time. Now, at this point now, after the last WTO ministerial, and considering the ministerial outcomes as they relate to e-commerce, it is a good opportunity to have a discussion about what comes next. And we look at the landscape, we have three main components. We have the work program of the WTO on e-commerce. We have the extension of the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. And we have the ongoing plurilateral negotiations that we call the Joint Statement Initiative negotiations on e-commerce. It is challenging to look at all this and see how all this can come together in a coherent scenario going forward. And this is where I would start with Jonathan and say, give us your thoughts, considering your exceptionally wide and diverse experience in all related issues here. How do you see the situation now, and how do you suggest we start unpacking it? So over to you, Jonathan.
Well, Hamid, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm privileged to also be a member of the Friends of Multilateralism group and in your company. And I must say, I look forward to your own insights, given your wealth of involvement and history, both as Director of Services and otherwise over many years. Hamid, you're quite right to begin by both recalling some history and identifying three major components, the work program, the moratorium, and the Joint Statement Initiative, all of which are in a state of flux, in part because the field is itself, as you implied, fast-moving, the advent of artificial intelligence, big data, which has value in its own right, posing new questions. And I'll add a fourth component, which is while we're in this fluid state in multilateral discussions, regionally and among like-minded countries, in addition to the Joint Statement Initiative, we're witnessing the advent of several additional agreements, either coming into force or being proposed: the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, the Australia-Singapore Agreement, the US-Canada USMCA, having all digital provisions as well. Some are similar, some are divergent. So you've got quite a menu of options on how to move forward. Add to that the questions now posed by the United States Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, who, before the ministerial, paused and said the United States needs to think through a little more carefully the various dimensions beyond the customs duties of international disciplines because of big data, because of anti-competitive impacts, be they national or international, and because of a range of public policy concerns that have come to the fore: personal privacy, cybersecurity, and so on. So all of which is to say we're in a state of flux. But before going forward, I think it's important to recall how much work has been done since the advent of the WTO's work program in 1998. It was recognized even then, in the early days of this digital world, that looking at e-commerce and digital trade involves dimensions that include trade in goods, trade in services, intellectual property, ownership and protection, and of course, a permanent feature of WTO discussions, a very important development dimension. And thus, ministers gave to the three councils, Goods Council, Services Council, and the TRIPS Council, as well as the Committee on Trade and Development, a remit to examine each of those dimensions, to report to the General Council, and through the General Council to ministers on how these various strands could be brought together in a manner that facilitates trade on the one hand and protects public interests and promotes development on the other. To be frank, and you may wish to elaborate from your inside perspective, the record has been spotty. It started, the work program, fairly robustly, and detailed reports were presented within a year back to the General Council with a good deal of analysis. It sputtered after a while. Discussions tended not to move very far, very fast. Differences became apparent, not just between East and West, but also between North and South. And as we know, even as between otherwise, you would think, like-minded nations, the ongoing discussions between the United States and the EU regarding transfer of data has raised questions about differing standards of privacy protection, cybersecurity, and so on. So the work program, while still alive, hasn't produced timely results in a way that might have been expected. At the end of the day, one of the major underlying issues is what on earth are we talking about when we talk about e-commerce? Some people differentiate between e-commerce on the one hand and digital trade on the other. Some people say, judging from the moratorium and talking about customs duties, there are very different issues for trade in goods than for trade in services. And of course, it's not a range of issues that belongs exclusively to the WTO. Digital standards, submarine cables, and so on belong to other international forums and organizations at the same time. So by the time of MC13, given all these questions and continuing differences and debates, ministers at least had the common sense to say, well, for now, let's continue the work program. Let's keep our pause on customs duties until we figure things out for at least 2 years. And just to preview a subject we may come to in a couple of minutes, ministers said, and both the work program and the moratorium will expire by the time of the next ministerial in 2 years' time. Now, that sounds very harsh and sounds like a noose hanging in front of us all. But frankly, it's the same situation as we've been in all the way along, which is things continue based on consensus to have them continue. And that's under review each and every time by ministers. So I wouldn't read the conclusions of MC13 as necessarily more negative than the situation we've been in coming into and coming out of previous ministerials. But Hamid, maybe given your sense of history, you can just add a word, if you would, about e-commerce as a field, because there is a WTO definition. The moratorium refers to electronic transmissions, a somewhat vague and ambiguous term. So what's the universe we're talking about here from your WTO understanding?
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for this question. This question has been lingering for a very long time. I'm sure that others have different views out there. But this whole story started in 98 when e-commerce was a new subject that has really impacted the way business is being done internationally. And the first instinct at the WTO, and here we're talking about like a couple of years after the establishment of the organization, these were the sort of golden years of the WTO, and everything was working very well until it didn't. But at the time, the logical tendency of the deliberative function was to say, okay, let's have a work program to unpack this phenomenon called e-commerce and see what it means for international trade. And that led to what you rightly mentioned, the mandate that was given to the councils and the Committee on Trade and Development. And they said, let's discuss what this means for WTO agreements. And as you rightly said, the work was going on quite well at the beginning. One example that comes to mind is the work that was done in the Services Council, where members at the time discussed how the provisions of the GATS, the Services Agreement, would apply to services transactions, to the supply of services through electronic means across the 4 modes of supply. And there is a report that actually is adopted by members. It's not a secretariat note. A report adopted by members, which reflects the collective understanding of the membership of how those provisions apply. So out of those discussions, we came up, or members came up, with the principle of technological neutrality, basically saying that we're dealing with trade in services and trade in goods, and the commitments under the WTO are about how those products are treated, goods or services, and about how foreign service suppliers are treated, regardless of what technology they use, how they are treated for the purposes of supplying their products. And of course, the biggest evidence for technological neutrality is the complete absence of any provision in the WTO that distinguishes between technological means used in supplying any product, goods or services. Now, that was a very, very important step forward. There was that report of the Services Council was delivered to the General Council in July 99. Now, we got into negotiations afterwards. You remember at that time, there was the built-in agenda negotiations, which started in January 2000, agriculture and services. And this is like a normal tendency. Whenever there's a negotiation, the deliberative function subsides because negotiators don't want the inconvenience of deliberations happening on the sidelines with respect to issues under negotiations. So it sort of faded away, and then things got further complicated when it was folded into the Doha round, 2001, and the rest is history. Now, while that process sort of subsided in the WTO, the world hasn't stopped. And what we're seeing today is a different picture with new technologies that have actually turbocharged this concept of digitalization. Now, one last word before I turn back to you about the moratorium. The moratorium was adopted with the work program because there was a discussion about classification. The moratorium story actually is a story about classification. The phenomenon of digitalization at the time raised questions about those products that were exchanged on physical carriers like software, music, books, DVDs, and so forth, all of a sudden became digitally deliverable. So the question in discussions was, should these be goods or services? And the classification systems, be it the HS on goods or the CPC on services, hadn't caught up at the time. And they said, some said, oh, they're goods. Some said, oh, they're services. And then the outcome of this was, okay, let's just have a moratorium on customs duties, because there are those of us who think that these are goods. Now, the word moratorium, by definition, in any dictionary, is a reference to a temporary measure. Any moratorium is temporary. Now, it was temporary, contingent upon outcomes from the discussions that never unfolded the way they were intended to their fullest extent. So that stayed as it is. The question is, you take a snapshot of that situation then, 25 years back, and then you look at the reality today about the classification issues. All those products that we had discussed as to whether they should be treated as goods or services are now actually classified in the CPC, the Central Product Classification System, the world experts of classification of goods and services, and they're classified as services. Chapter 48 of the CPC has a new section called Online Content Services. There you find all those products. So when we look at the moratorium, I think the moratorium served a very, very useful purpose, no doubt. The question now, and maybe we can expand on this in a few minutes, the question is it about time we move beyond this temporary measure called the moratorium and look at the new realities and where the substantive interest lies and how do we pursue it? But you have also extensive experience, Jonathan, on the finance front. And one of the issues that come up with respect to e-commerce also is taxation. And sometimes even taxation is referred to as the logical instrument to use as opposed to customs duties. And the moratorium has an ambiguous scope anyway. Electronic transmissions is not agreed by any definition. But what would be your thoughts about using taxation as an instrument from a trade perspective? Now, taxation is not the business of trade negotiators, but there is an interface with respect to discrimination. But what would be your thoughts on that?
So let me preface that with just a couple of quick footnotes to your very articulate recall of the evolution of the moratorium. Right from the beginning, the moratorium was embodied in a declaration, not a decision, not an agreement, so it's not legally enforceable. In fact, the 1998 ministerial decision says, in the meantime, we will continue our practice of not imposing duties. So it's habit, it's not a code. So everyone is exercising forbearance. And there is, of course, longstanding a debate as to whether customs duties can and should be available to apply to services in addition to goods. Traditionally, the customs services of the world are accustomed to applying duties to goods. It's tough for border services agencies to get a hold of services, let alone assign a tariff to them. So right now, because of the discussions still to be had, it frankly does make sense to have that moratorium continue while deliberations continue. So the real debate is, if you're trying to ensure a level playing field between domestic and foreign providers of goods and services, and you can't quite reconcile on the services side doing something at the border, then taxation is a very common and normal measure. We tax foreign corporations and domestic corporations, assessing their profits and monies earned. It's a domestic measure. It's not a border measure, of course. With the advent of the digital age, what we're seeing, and I suppose it's fair to say that both in the G7, G20 context, and particularly at the OECD, there's quite a bit of work among the finance and tax officials, well advanced on digital taxation, triggered by concerns about the global profits being earned by electronic platforms, be it Amazon or Facebook or what have you, by the major internet providers, Microsoft and so on, who earn money around the world and who may be incorporated in a low tax jurisdiction, even though the customers and clients in various countries are paying money, and those countries are helping to generate revenue for these big firms. So the discussions have been focused on not so much domestic versus foreign, but a global interest in ensuring that these firms pay their fair share of tax, number one, and number two, that the right to tax is allocated fairly, generally speaking, in accordance with the principle that you should pay tax where you earn your money. So can one get an agreed formula as to how to allocate profits among the various taxing jurisdictions? That requires data regarding your customer base, requires agreements on disclosure of information, requires some agreement that there maybe needs to be a minimum tax so that you don't get into a race to the bottom for attracting low tax jurisdictions. And are there special rules that may be different for, let's say, banks who do cross-border business versus streaming services like Netflix or others who beam from abroad and have customer bases around? And can you do so based on principles similar to the WTO, such as non-discrimination and national treatment, so that you're not biasing things against the farm, but having fair competition. So those discussions have been ongoing for a few years. They're well advanced. Some people thought there would be an OECD agreement on this universe this past year. It didn't quite gel, but there's some optimism that in the course of this year, there may be agreement, and that would set a good precedent for putting to one side what would otherwise be seen as border-related measures in favor of a very familiar and, as you say, very pervasive tool, which is domestic tax. And the history in the WTO and the GATT before that is trade people will defer to finance and tax people regarding their levels of expertise, including referring such questions back to the experts to assess whether such taxes or financial measures are fairly applied. So you're right to flag this. You're right to emphasize that you can't have a WTO trade-related measure discussion without regard to the alternative domestic measures that may be more suited to the task.
That's true, and I believe that the OECD came out actually recommending the use of taxation as opposed to customs duties in the case of digital trade. Now, this is quite interesting, and that's a very interesting insight into the sort of tax world, and I remember the differences between tax officials and tax authorities and trade policy negotiators. We went through this during the drafting of the GATS, and that's why you have a big exception in the GATS regarding the imposition of taxes and the right to deviate from some rules of non-discrimination, subject to necessity, of course, but the fact that the tax measures are to be treated within a different policy framework is long recognized. Let me go back to something you said, Jonathan, which is quite interesting about the MC13 decision. There is a language there, as you rightly referred to, which says that it will expire in 2 years. Now, of course, effectively, you're right. There can be a consensus that extends it still. So in sort of in legal terms or in procedural terms, that's not very different from previous situations. But wouldn't that language, in your view, create at least a presumption of finality? Because it never appeared in any previous decision. From a negotiating point of view, you don't see any significance for that new language.
Well, I think you're right in political and public relations terms that those countries or economies that wish to reserve the right to apply duties, be they to goods or services, can argue that we're just getting ready to do that, on the one hand. On the other, given some of the frustrations that maybe the agenda coming out of the work program hasn't been as robust as it should be on developing country concerns and so on, it's in effect can be interpreted as a plea that the mood has soured a bit. The differences, as I said right at the outset, both between East and West and North and South, are apparent. So it's a reminder that we really do need to redouble our efforts, given the pace of acceleration of digitalization, to come to some modicum of understanding on the regulatory side and on the development side. So sure, there's a little bit of negativity, but as you said, and I said both, from a legal perspective, it's still very open to ministers in 2 years' time to say we've reached a new consensus to continue a moratorium, to continue or refine the work program, and maybe even to pocket some interim results along the way, depending on the joint statement initiative and regional developments in the meantime as well.
That's a very interesting thought, because you actually touched upon the point that provoked that question in my mind, which is, if this new language can provide a stimulus to get on with the work that hasn't been proceeding as actively as we hoped, on the deliberative side, to clarify some of those issues in order to inform the agenda going forward. And you rightly basically said, well, that might actually be sort of a warning sign that this cannot go on forever. Yes, of course, it can be extended, but it's about time that we get on with it and look at the new realities, particularly after so many years have passed. Now, the other thing I sort of wanted to also get your thoughts on is the ongoing JSI, plurilateral negotiation. Now, of course, plurilateral negotiations are not new in the history of the multilateral system, not just the WTO. Actually, I always say that in the history of the multilateral trading system since 1947, the only really true, fully multilateral round that took place is the Uruguay round. Everything else has more or less been negotiated by a subset of the membership. So technically, the negotiating processes themselves are always plurilateral. But there seems to be a new level of sensitivity towards plurilateral negotiations now, which I think is politically generated more than systemically or substantively. But with this particular initiative on e-commerce, where do you see it going, or where do you hope that it would go as it relates to the WTO?
Well, I want to come back to you regarding how there are various techniques for joining a plurilateral initiative to the corpus of WTO rights and obligations. We should come back to that. You and I are both hampered a bit because the JSI text is not available to us or our audience. It's being kept closely held while they work through some of the outstanding issues. There are some reports, both from the conveners, who just met in the last couple of weeks, but also, whether it's leaks or sources or otherwise, some hint of what some of the fundamental outstanding issues are. But add to the JSI, and some of those issues that are outstanding do relate to privacy, recalling the US-EU differences that we're aware of, China's rights that they've reserved regarding access to data, various countries insisting on localization requirements on data, and the advent of AI, which Catherine Tai has highlighted as needing to be thought through. But in addition to that, at last count, there's over 100 different regional and bilateral trade agreements that have some digital provisions in them. And among them, some are very prominent. And I mentioned them before: the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, the CPTPP, USMCA, Australia, Singapore, and so on. And as we know, regarding other trade disciplines, sometimes these regional and plurilateral agreements provide inspiration and leadership and a catalyst for letting them evolve into more multilateral rules. That suggests that there's actually quite a responsibility, dare I say, on the chairs of the three councils and the Committee on Trade and Development, and in particular on the chair of the General Council, to drive a renewed and more robust and more timely work program that points to results. So there's two things that have to move in parallel. One is the proponents and adherents to a potential JSI, and apparently that's 90 out of 166 WTO member countries. But the 90 comprise, I'm told, 90% of the world's digital trade. And we can recall the Information Technology Agreement and the ITA2 that in effect became multilateral because the proponents said, well, since we're 95% of the world anyway, we're prepared to give free rides even to non-adherents. So we've multilateralized it. That's a possibility for the JSI as well. So that runs in parallel with a work program. So if you assume the JSI crystallizes in the course of this year, which is their target, and the work program is renewed and reinvigorated this year as well, you still have a full year available to you in earnest. And in parallel, we also referred to the OECD tax discussions, which could enlighten things as well, to actually pull something together on a multilateral basis. But coming back to your question, and recalling the ITA, it is also plausible that the 90 countries, and maybe a few more will join, say we've reached a plurilateral agreement. And we believe this should be linked to the WTO. Now, there are various models for doing that. The WTO provides for annexing under Annex 4 a formal agreement and attaching. But we also have the precedent in financial services and otherwise of a number of countries voluntarily scheduling their commitments. And cumulatively, that adds up to attaching plurilateral undertakings into WTO schedules. But you are the expert, and you've lived through those options in various settings. Am I accurate in what I've just described?
I think you're pretty accurate, John, because a key entry point to this conversation about plurilaterals is a distinction between whether we're talking about plurilateral negotiations, the negotiating process, or we're talking about a plurilateral outcome, because they involve different procedural and legal questions. If we're talking about a plurilateral negotiation, it's a common practice in the system that any subset of members may engage in a negotiation. The fact that they engage in the negotiation itself, there are no requirements for any consensus decision. We had the ITA launched, conducted, concluded, entered into force without a single consensus decision. Nobody said anything. Why? Because it's a common practice. All of a sudden, with the domestic regulation outcome, which is identical in legal character to ITA, there were questions about plurilateral negotiations. These are, I think, are political tensions that ought to be ironed out in proper conversations that should take place in the WTO, conversations that are politically courageous and intellectually straightforward to clarify the rules. And then we move on to the choices. Looking at this JSI, there is nothing that is being negotiated, to my knowledge, which cannot be scheduled under the GATT and the GATS. And by the way, you can schedule regulatory obligations under the GATT. We visited that option, and we actually concluded by I mean lawyers of the WTO and of the membership, concluded that you can schedule regulatory obligations. We visited this during the trade facilitation negotiations when the protocol was blocked. So we have established that option as viable. Now, whether they would want to do that would depend on whether they want to apply the outcome on an MFN basis, on a non-discriminatory basis. Now, the choice of whether you apply the outcome on an MFN basis or you apply it only on a plurilateral basis, in my view, historically, and this is my view, it depends on the nature of the outcome. If the outcome is of a market access nature, like ITA, then you would need critical mass so that outsiders cannot disrupt the competitive relationships within participating countries. In which case, they achieved critical mass in ITA, the same as in financial services, the same as in telecommunications, and it was applied on an MFN basis. But if your outcome is purely of regulatory nature, then there isn't much room for discrimination there. And we've seen this also in regulatory outcomes. The fact that you applied on a most favored nation is simply creating rights for non-participants, but you're going to extend the same treatment to them anyway. So why would you go through the political hurdles and pay a high political price to have a plurilateral outcome if that very outcome is going to be applied on a non-discriminatory basis anyway? Now, these, of course, are choices that participating countries would have to make, and then decide on what they want to do. Now, you refer to investment facilitation, which is, I think, is a very different example from these two options, because investment facilitation cannot be scheduled. Here, we're comparing between scheduling and making the outcome part of a pre-existing treaty, which is a very straightforward thing, and creating a new agreement, a new standalone agreement, which is not binding on everyone, but does not create rights for non-participants under Annex 4. But the investment facilitation agreement cannot be scheduled because there's no place within the treaty
to attach it to.
Yeah, exactly. Then they're going to Annex 4, but then the question is, it's all regulatory issues. There is no market access there. So why would you go through that hurdle? That's a more complicated conversation that can take place some other time. But I think back to your question about the options, I think for e-commerce, the options are clear. The outcome is not going to be binding on everyone, so you can schedule it and apply it on MFN basis, or you can go to Annex 4. But Annex 4, and even looking at the agreements now in Annex 4, the two agreements, government procurement and trade and civil aircraft, they're mainly market access agreements. They're not much about regulation. So it's up to them, and we'll see what they're going to choose.
Well, I know we're running out of time, but we're masking what may be a very complex discussion depending on the various provisions that we haven't seen of the JSI. In the name of development and in the name of inclusion, for example, and some of the bilateral and mini plurilateral agreements have this, is an undertaking to ensure and promote access to the internet. That helps rural populations, that helps the consumer, the MSMEs, and so on. So that's almost reverse of market access. You're saying you need domestically to undertake to ensure that there's adequate internet that is accessible by your population. The secondary question is, if you don't have the infrastructure yet domestically, does that imply that you have to open the door to the big providers from abroad, which may prevent your own indigenous internet capacity from developing? So it's an implicit market access demand built into inclusion and the consumer interest. So do you extend that without getting some concessions in return? That's for another day. That's for the work program and for
Definitely.
the participants to work through.
Definitely, and you're right. We ran out of time. This is a conversation that could go on for a much longer time, but there we are. And what remains here for me to do is just to really thank you so sincerely, Jonathan, for this conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope that whoever listens to this conversation would find it useful and informative at such a critical time for the system. So thank you very much.
let me reciprocate, Hamid, because as always, your insights and explanations are very, very helpful. And what it says is for the Friends of Multilateralism and for other caucuses, there's actually quite a bit to be discussed further and for views to be conveyed back to our respective representatives in Geneva to get
Indeed.
this program reinvigorated. Indeed.
Indeed. Let's hope for the best.
Indeed. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Bye-bye.
All the best. Bye-bye.